Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is our weekly vlog, video podcast, where we talk about what's happening in the legislative session, what's happening in the world of policy, and with Washington Policy Center research. We're joined by our center directors on a regular basis, on rare occasion, outside guests as well will inform us about the latest on what's happening. I want to encourage you as we wait for people to be able to log in and join us. I want to encourage you, especially with this new time, to check out our blog at washingtonpolicy.org. That's washingtonpolicy.org. The blog there, we have some tremendous stuff coming from our research center directors every day, and you can really capture a lot of Olympia news that you just don't see anywhere else. Especially as media continues, traditional media continues to be challenged in the marketplace and shrink its overall scope. That news coming from Olympia, that perspective that Washington Policy Center provides, can be more important than ever for you to keep track of. So I would encourage you to check out regularly the news on our blog, and also share that information on your social media with your friends and others, because obviously our information doesn't do any good if people are just sitting on it. We need you to share it, to amplify it, to help us get that information and messaging out there. One of the things that came out today, before we get to our guest center director today, was some work from Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, who just did a tremendous job over the, some people spend the President's Day holiday weekend preparing for a barbecue. Todd spent it looking over the budget proposals from the State House and the State Senate. And he found something interesting, which was some Washington State residents are going to be receiving, if this budget passes, $200 checks this year, using the revenue from the tax on CO2 emissions, the cap and trade tax. But there's conditions to it. One, the Senate majority proposal, I should say. So the Democrats have the majority in both the House and the Senate. The Senate proposal requires checks to be sent in 2024. The House version cancels some payments. They pay out some required in 2024, but then they would cancel the second payment that would be scheduled for, I think it's February of next year, if Initiative 2117 passed and there was a repeal of the cap and trade tax. But remember, as Todd points out, this has nothing to do with that initiative would repeal the tax, cap and trade tax, but it would not refund money that was collected. So they already have the money, but they would cancel the payment, the second payment that they're dangling in front of some Washington residents. The other thing is both budgets would require the utilities and organizations that would send the payments to use government-approved language. And the reason that's significant, as Todd points out, is that previously there was requirements that utility payers not be informed of the increased cost of the cap and trade tax. So, previously, when there was some kind of communication there, the members of the Utilities Commission, and suggested by the Office of the State Attorney General, they prohibited the utilities from listing the cost of the CO2 tax on consumers' bills. So when people were wondering, why are things getting more expensive, they couldn't say it. And then, of course, with gas prices, it's something similar, with Governor Inslee claiming all kinds of different things, from being misled by his own departments to saying it's oil company profits that strangely end at Washington State's borders, and ignoring the 2014 studies that his own administration commissioned, showing that the cap and trade tax, as imagined, would increase the price of gasoline about 44 cents per gallon. All of those things ignored by the governor now, just trying to live in denial about what the real cost is of the cap and trade tax on fuel and energy. And Todd Myers, our director of our Department of the Environment, has just done a tremendous job detailing what the actual impact costs are. And of course, what alternatives are as well. And Todd's been fantastic about trying to find alternatives for people. He also has some big news coming out about salmon numbers. I don't know if he's had time to post that blog yet or not, but we can expect to see that coming up as well. Not the numbers of salmon literally, but numbers in terms of how some politicians who prioritize or claim to prioritize the recovery of salmon as a very important environmental milestone, especially for the Pacific Northwest, how their words are measuring up to the reality. And so you'll see that likely coming up as well. So again, there's some awfully strange and disturbing strings that come with these proposed $200 payments regarding the cap and trade tax. And you can read more about it at washingtonpolicy.org and hopefully shortly in the Spokesman Review, among other places as well. All right, and now I want to turn to Pam Lewison. She is our Center for Agriculture Director, and we want to talk to her about what's going on in the world of Washington agriculture, because as people forget, and I want to preface this for people, especially from Western Washington, ag is our number 2 economic engine in the state. So a lot of people forget, they think of high tech and Boeing and other things, and obviously those are important, but agriculture remains a big economic engine in our state. But there's fewer and fewer farms. Why don't you walk us through your latest observations and project, Pam, and tell us what's happening.
Because I am a professional nerd, courtesy of Washington Policy Center, I get to do things like read new results from the National Census of Agriculture. It is a census just like the one that is sent out to the general population that everybody has to do every 10 years or so. The difference is that the Census of Agriculture is administered every 5 years. And it sort of is a good way to take the temperature of the health of your agricultural community. And it is disaggregated in a couple of ways. So you can either look at how things are looking on a national scale, or the USDA Department of National Agricultural Statistics also distills it down to a state level. So for us, obviously, the important one is Washington. The results from the 2022 Census of Agriculture were just released last week, and there are some worrying trends in that census. Particularly, I think the most concerning is that between 2017, when the last census was done, and 2022, we had a loss of farms. If you follow agricultural policy, that should not surprise anyone. But for those of you who don't, we had a few things happening in that time frame. We had the passage of overtime. We had some proposed legislation around farm workers and farm owners in particular being labeled as slaves. We had some changes in L&I. Our wages have increased pretty consistently over the last several years as well. And I won't say that it's that correlation equals causation, but certainly I think there's a relationship between what our policies in this state look like and the number of losses in farms that we've had over the last 5 years. And to paint that picture a little bit more of a point, over the last 5 years, we have lost 743 farms every year for 5 years. So what that distills down to is 14 farms a week. Which is an astronomical amount.
Is that spiking correlating to anything, or is that just, an inevitable trend? That's question number 1. And then a quick follow-up on that. When farms disappear, and maybe this isn't clear from the data, but does that mean that they're eaten by a larger farm, so to speak, or absorbed by the larger farm, or does this mean the farmland is surrendered to other things like development or other kinds of work?
So there's sort of a couple of things I think that are going on. The first, when you look at what this data looks like, you can't necessarily pinpoint to a specific year and say, this is the year that this started and we had this sudden sharp increase. So you really are looking at averages because it's not broken down by year. But I think that you can do some averaging and say, over the long term, this is what we're seeing. And it is different in this particular 5-year period, specifically because when you look at that 743 farms a year that we're losing, that's about twice as many as we have lost in the previous 2 census cycles. So previously, we were losing about half that many during the course of 2 5-year terms. If that makes, I think I'm explaining that right for everybody. And there are, there's a couple of things that happen. When you look at the data, it tells you that the average size of farms in Washington has increased. So we went from about 380 acres being the average size farm to the new average being 432 acres. So that indicates that there's a little bit of consolidation going on. So you see with those losses that some of those farms got absorbed by other farms, and that made the average farm size get bigger. However, certainly some of those losses were to development. And you see that particularly when you look at the listing in the data for farms under 50 acres. So for those of us in the commercial ag space like myself, a 50-acre farm is quite small. And we in Washington, the vast majority of our farms are 50 acres or less, actually 49 acres or less, which says that you have 2 things that are sort of running parallel. You have consolidation on one side and development on the other, which leaves just small farms kind of in that middle area.
Well, let's first take a question from Bob, since he's posted it. Has there been any movement in Olympia on getting certain employers a seasonal or harvest season exemption from the new overtime rules that took effect January 1st? And I skipped to that question because we've been talking about this a long time, and you've been saying these overtime rules are detrimental to farmers. Could this question and your current topic be related in that there's been these proposals and the adding on of regulations over time, and some farmers are just seeing they're seeing the writing on the road, so to speak, saying this is coming down the pike. I'm not equipped to deal with it. I'm a smaller farm. I've got to change.
So there has been no movement on any kind of seasonal or harvest flexibility for overtime. So for folks who are sort of following that a little bit more closely, Bob is one of them. What we have seen is we had a hearing in Senate Labor 2 weeks ago-ish, and both the pro and con side of the seasonality argument were given a panel of 3 people to testify. They each got their time to shine, and then testimony was closed, hearing was over, and there was no movement on the bill. And so the bill died in committee. It was basically indicated.
Can you start that over, because you disconnected there for a moment?
Sorry. Yeah. So about 2 weeks ago, we had a hearing about seasonality and overtime flexibility, but there's been no movement on it. What happened was there was a pro and con panel that were allowed to testify. Then the hearing was closed and the bill died in committee. So we will effectively have to start over next session. And I think what you will find is, as we start to look at those farm attrition rates and delve deeper into that moving forward, certainly labor is going to be part of that. When you look at what the census data tells us, farm labor during the last census result accounted for $2.18 billion in ag expenses during that period of time. So labor was the single largest expense for any farm in the state. In the 2022 data set, it jumped up to 2.76 billion. So a significant increase, and it did not change. It is still the biggest part of our operating expenses in ag.
Has the total acreage of farms changed? That's a question from Mark.
Yes, so it has declined.
From Steve, does the survey indicate how many acres of Washington are engaged in agriculture, and has that increased or decreased? Similar to the same question, but does it show how much land is used for rangeland, cropland, and such? So a diversity of farming, and that's a fair question, I think.
So it does not get down to a granular level about how acres are used, only that those acres are involved in agriculture in some way. So once more state reports are distilled down, we will get more of that information. But at this particular moment with this initial release, all we see is those sort of aggregate numbers that these things are happening. And as I said earlier, total number of acres has declined throughout the state. So that goes back to those parallel tracks of consolidation, but also that development piece as well.
Now, I know your policy note on the subject is coming out here shortly. Heck, I'm in charge of releasing it, and right now I'll pop in. I don't recall which day that's coming out, but it's coming up here shortly. And I was wondering, is there anything in the current legislative session that you're watching? You know, I know this is kind of a subject that's a little bit outside of the legislative session, but certainly related to it. Are there any other pieces of legislation that you're watching right now that either are going to add the burden to agriculture that could exacerbate this problem, or some kind of compromise that we've talked about in the past, like the buffer bill compromise and other things, something that's positive that you're kind of seeing where sides are able to work together and try to boost Washington agriculture right now?
I think it's interesting this session because there was a lot of legislation proposed at the beginning that felt a little bit more positive. Some of those bills have moved forward and some of them haven't. So a couple of examples of that are the beef checkoff bill. For folks who don't know, every beef producer in Washington has to pay a small fee into a state and national marketing campaign, effectively, for beef advocacy. It is the only checkoff in our particular state that is governed by the legislature. They've come to a consensus. It took 2 tries to come to an agreement amongst all of the cattlemen and cattlewomen about how that fee structure was going to change. So that looks like it'll move forward, and I think that's a positive thing for the Beef Commission. But there's a lot of interest in promoting organic agriculture. If that's your predilection, I think there's room for all kinds of food production. So I'm never opposed to seeing more seats at the table. But I also think there are still some really, and there is also still alive, I believe, one of a pair of gray wolf management bills that was brought forth by Representative Joel Kretz. So I'm hopeful to see that go across the line as well. For our folks up in the northeast part of the state, they desperately need some help. But I think there are still a couple of bills too that are really concerning, and they're in strange places. So everyone, I think at this point, is aware, or hopefully is aware of the striking workers unemployment insurance bill. There is no exemption for agriculture in that piece of legislation. So unlike manufacturers whose employees can go on strike and go back to work with no significant long-term consequences, if farm workers go on strike during harvest, that farm very likely ceases to exist. So there needs to at least be an exemption for agriculture in that bill so that we can save our food producers. And then also both the House and Senate budgets have a really interesting proviso about dredge and fill language. So it is, from ecology standpoint, it is supposed to help save our waterways and fish and all those sorts of things. But from an agricultural perspective, what it will do is it will effectively go against what we are trying to do with the riparian work group that's working through how ag, ecology, and environmental activists and salmon folks and our tribal community members can all come together to a better solution for what our riparian buffers should look like.
Yeah, that's no small list there. Some of those things are, as you point out, when you think about the difference, the thing that disturbs me is when you're describing the labor bill particularly. There just hasn't been a lot of concern about the different way farming is from everything else in terms of, there is no mercy on the harvest season, right? I mean, it's there or it's not. And if you don't get it, it's ruined. And it seems like there's a lot of people in the policy world that don't take that. They don't truly understand the implications of it and the power of it. History is filled with experiments in farming done by people who were not farmers that did not turn out well. let me put it that way. And anything else you want to share with us, Pam, before I let you go? Oh, wait, we've got a couple of questions for you. Let's see here. This includes an opinion on your opinion on SSB 3604 that includes a provision that prohibits trucks over 10,000 pounds from idling for over 5 minutes. So much for keeping fresh produce fresh. Can you address that and why that would be a problem for keeping produce fresh for those who don't actually know?
I'll email Bob because I'll be honest, I didn't read the bill. So it's transportation is not something I focus on if I don't have to. But I'll go back and take a look at it and I'll shoot him an email with an answer.
Thanks. All right. Appreciate you coming on. As always, Pam, you do a great job and really informative today. So, and I tell everybody now who's watching, concerned about agriculture or know people who could be and should be, I'd encourage you to share this when we post it up on our YouTube channel. Hope you'll pick it up and share with friends as well. Thanks a lot, Pam. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
You bet. I wanted to share one more thing, and this was a fact check from Paul Guppy that was posted. And this is because the Senate Majority Leader was interviewed, and that interview, at least portions of it, were published on a news site called Center Square. And it was a statement that the capital gains income tax, the effort to repeal it, would result in the loss of money for the state, could reduce K-12 funding, and quote unquote devastate funding for certain state programs. And Paul pointed out, this is valuable information, I think, that the state is not going to lose any money, even if voters were to pass such a thing. If the state did not collect revenue of that scope, the state revenue would still increase by billions of dollars every year under the current tax system, with or without that particular tax. So Paul points out the amount of money taken by the state has doubled in 10 years, up over 100%, while consumer price index inflation went up 34%, and is projected to continue to increase by billions coming up. And then that same upward trend applies to K-12 public schooling spending. K-12 spending has doubled since 2013, rising from $13.5 billion to $29 billion. Public schools spend over $19,000 per student per year. K-12 employees are among the highest paid public employees in the state. And K-12 spending, while that spending has increased, the number of students have declined, with about 46,000 families leaving the system. So it's really interesting context that Paul provided there. And again, you find that at washingtonpolicy.org. And I wanted to alert you to that because, one of the big conversation pieces is whenever there's a proposal of any kind where there's some effort to reduce the amount collected by government, it's described as a loss. But if you've got an increase of money coming your way, only government can describe that as a loss. So that's a challenge. I appreciate all of you watching Washington Policy on the Go with the new time of 12:15. I hope that worked out well with everybody. And we'll be back to you next week, every week during the legislative session. Thanks for joining us.